Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Okay, everybody, welcome to today's show. Today's show is going to be all about something we call intermittent energy restriction, or IER for short. Now, you don't want to confuse this with intermittent fasting. They are very different things in the research. And intermittent energy restriction is really a tool that you need to understand, whether you're a coach or a physician or just a serious fitness enthusiast. If you're trying to lose weight or help anyone else lose weight, you really need to understand intermittent energy restriction in a very big way, because I've been using this in my clinic for a very long time, probably going back to 2010. And recently there's been a interest in this because we had one study, which I have done a previous podcast on. I don't remember the episode, on the Matador study. And this particular study showed that by interspersing diet weeks with non-diet weeks, you got a better result than if you just dieted continuously. Now, this particular study has been looked at several different ways, and other studies that weren't exactly the same were done showing no benefit. And so there's a debate going on. Should we be looking at doing intermittent energy restriction or continuous energy restriction? Continuous energy restriction meaning the exact way we've always done it, or is this intermittent energy restriction better? And just briefly, the difference between the two is intermittent energy restriction has periods of time where you have moderate to severe calorie reductions followed by isocaloric levels for a period of time, okay? And then back and repeat. Continuous energy restriction is just a constant calorie reduction. So there's a difference here. You can kind of think of intermittent energy restriction as the high-intensity interval training of dieting, right? There's these periods where you push hard and then you rest, versus continuous energy restriction being more the steady-state cardio sort of deal, where you just keep going at the same steady pace. So intermittent energy restriction may have benefits. Now, in my clinical experience, it certainly does. And I'm going to tell you how I've used this and different ways you can use this in your clinical practice yourself. I get a lot of doctors and nutritionists and health coaches and trainers and naturopathic physicians who listen to my podcast, but many of you are just plain listeners who are wanting to better your health, and I want to teach you all about this. Now, before we get into intermittent energy restriction and why it might be a good idea, we first have to cover something that I call metabolic compensation, or the research calls metabolic adaptation. Let's cover that first. Here's what happens whenever you eat less and or exercise more. Whenever you create a calorie deficit in the body, and the more severe that deficit is, the bigger the gap between calorie intake and calorie output, this can register as a stress to your physiology, to your metabolism. Makes sense, right? Like, obviously, if you are, a hunter-gatherer, and you're not getting any food, you can't find any food, you're in the middle of winter, or you're going through a dry spell in terms of food, there's not a lot of animals around, there's not a lot of foliage around, you have low calories, you can't find any food, and you're also walking around a lot and trying to hunt and just missing and putting out a lot of energy but not getting anything back in, then you understand that from an evolutionary perspective, the body should have protective mechanisms to keep you from starving. And it does. What it begins to do, because we as a species, evolutionarily speaking, most of our existence, 99.9% of our existence on this planet, was all about food shortage, food insecurity. There wasn't food abundance like there is now. And so our physiology, our metabolism is built to protect us against hunger. It registers this stress, this gap between intake and output, and it begins to do several things. It begins to first increase your hunger and your cravings. It begins to increase your motivation or drive for food. This would make sense, right? Because it gets you out of the cold, wet cave, or comfortable cave rather, to go out and hunt when you wouldn't want to do that. So you have this motivation to go seek energy, especially high density, highly palatable, hedonistic types of foods, things with lots of fat and sugar, right? So you have this drive. It also will begin to suppress energy. At times you might feel unpredictable and unstable energy. Sometimes it might be high, sometimes it might be low, but energy is basically down-regulated to a degree. Not only is hunger and cravings elevated and energy sort of down-regulated, but metabolic rate also, the amount you burn at rest energy, the amount of energy you burn at rest, which is called basal metabolic rate or BMR or REE, resting energy expenditure, goes down. So what we think happens based on this compensation is for your typical human who begins to eat less and exercise more for any length of time and to do this continuous calorie restriction, what ends up happening is you increase hunger, you increase cravings, you make your energy unpredictable and unstable. I have called this your HEC going out of check. Hunger, energy, cravings, HEC, HEC going out of check. And you also have a drop in basal metabolic rate. Now, this drop in basal metabolic rate has to do with several different factors. The thyroid is involved, leptin is involved, different hormones are involved with this. And we believe that for your average person weighing about 180 pounds, this drop in metabolic rate can be anywhere on average from 200 to 300 calories on average. There is some people who say this could be as much higher than that and maybe as high as 800 calories. I don't really buy that. Perhaps that could be the case, certain individuals having a severe drop in metabolic rate. And some say that others may not have much of a drop at all. And of course, we know through the law of metabolic individuality that there's going to be individual variations here. But we also can see statistically with diets, the fact that 95% of people don't keep the weight off, and 66% end up fatter as a result of going on these continuous energy restriction diets. We can see that for most people, this is true, right? We know, anyone who's been on a diet knows hunger, energy, and cravings goes out of check, and it seems like you can't burn off the fat as fast as you want, and you end up gaining it way faster, and then it's harder to burn off next time. These are all protective mechanisms that explain metabolic compensation. So the whole idea then of intermittent energy restriction is this idea of, can we perhaps by having very short, intense periods of calorie reduction and calorie output, can we lose large amounts of fat and avoid the compensation and keep it off? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And one of my favorite studies, which is a very small study, so we have to be very careful about that. And it was also just done in men, but it also illustrates what I have done in my clinical practice, what I've seen work with myself, and what I've seen work with many patients. It reinforces that. So we're going to go over this, and then you can begin to try this yourself. I also have heard from many clinicians who I've taught this method to that they also see that it works. And so while we don't know for sure if this is the best thing we have, it certainly has been the best thing that I have used. And we'll have to let science sort of tease this out, because perhaps intermittent energy restriction works for a certain subpopulation of people, and then continuous energy restriction sort of works for another subset, or maybe there's a balance between the two. But let's get into this. So the whole idea of intermittent energy restriction is to essentially, probably, hopefully, avoid this hunger, energy, and cravings going out of check and this slowdown in basal metabolic rate and this weight regain, right? That's what we're trying to avoid. So if you go into the research, and this is not clear, but when I did sort of a deep dive in this years and years back, what is stuck in my mind is this idea of when does compensation begin? And it happens for different people at different rates. But it looks like after about 4 to 7 days at the earliest, that you can begin getting some metabolic compensations. It seems like maybe you can go as long as maybe 14 days before you start getting these metabolic compensations. And a lot of us know what this is like, don't we? When we go on a diet, sort of the standard, typical, eat less, exercise more, continuous energy restriction. When we do this, what happens is it's a little hard the first 2 days, right? It's kind of changing some patterns, eating less. We have to be a little bit more mindful. And then there's about a 2-day period of time there where we feel pretty good, right? Pretty good. And it may even last up to a week where we're like, oh my God, this is easy. I'm not as hungry as I was. Cravings aren't there. My energy's up. I feel good. I've lost a couple pounds. And then what happens? Then it all comes crashing back, right? Next thing you know, you have increased hunger, cravings through the roof, energy unpredictable, and the fat weight or the weight loss begins to plateau. And then inevitably, you have that donut, which turns into 2 donuts, which turns into 5 burgers, which turns into 10 pizzas, right? You basically end up, going into this, from this eat less, exercise more approach into this eat more, exercise less approach. There's this idea that the very thing you were trying to do to get the weight off is actually causing the things that come next. So eating less and exercising more causes this metabolic compensation, which then causes you to eat more and exercise less. So the question is, could we perhaps in this 4 to 14 day time period before we start losing willpower and having lots of these heck reactions, could we sort of do something rather extreme and really try to get the weight off all at once and then go back to a balanced sort of level? Could that happen? That's what we're going to sort of look at. Now, here's the problem, though, that you need to understand. The reverse of this is something we need to cover first, because we do this all the time in reverse, right? We eat good during the week. We binge on the weekend. We gain a small amount of weight. We eat good during the week. We binge on the weekend. We gain a small amount of weight. Or we eat good most weeks, and then a special event comes, someone at our work brings cake or something like that, or we go out and binge, or we have a holiday or something like that, we gain a little weight, and we slowly tick up this weight. In other words, we stay stable, then we have these big binging, sort of times with friends, holidays, special events, times at work, weekend binges, and our weight slowly ticks up. As a matter of fact, we know from looking statistically that most people gain a few pounds at Thanksgiving and don't really take that off. So basically, they'll gain like 5 pounds at Thanksgiving right around that time. Here in America, if you're listening to this, we have this period of time from Thanksgiving, which in our world is November, end of November, all the way to New Year's, where we have a very heavy eating time. Lots of holidays, parties going on, lots of time with family, lots of big meals. Many people can gain up to 5 to 10 pounds during that time. They end up losing some of it, but some stays on. And so every year they sort of tick up. So we're doing this all the time. We're just doing it in reverse. So intermittent energy restriction says, why don't we do what we're doing, offset that by having interspersed periods during the year or during the week or during the month where we have these extreme sort of drops in calories. And so this is the idea. Now, the other thing that we need to look at here is that chronic stress and acute stress are 2 different things. So if you think about it, the body cannot adapt to chronic stress. It does not do well with chronic stress. With chronic stress, it becomes more insulin resistant, more cortisol is released. You have hunger and cravings. Your motivation goes down, right? And you're not able to adapt to chronic stress. So when you think about continuous calorie restriction, continuous energy restriction, you can kind of see that as perhaps a chronic stress on the system. When you look at intermittent energy restriction, that looks more like acute stress. Now, acute stresses we do really well with. Acute stress, the body can react to, adjust to, and adapt to. And so, in a sense, you can kind of think of continuous energy restriction as perhaps more chronic stress oriented. The body does not do as well adapting to it. But this intermittent energy restriction might be more of an acute stress adaptation response. And of course, a lot of this is speculative. I have seen it work fantastic. I'm going to tell you about a study that looked at this right now. And you also want to go back and look at the Matador study, realizing that this is still up in the air. Science is slow. We have to kind of prove this out. But in clinical practice, I have found it to be one of the best things. And you can begin to use this. And then we will let the science refine the approach as we move forward. So here's my study. The study is a study called Time Efficient Reduction of Fat Mass in 4 days with Exercise and Caloric Restriction. So this was a 4-day program. Now, let's go the overview real quick. There were essentially several different sort of pieces to this. Phase 1 basically lasted about 2 days. And in phase 1, there was no exercise done or anything like that. Everyone had the diet that they were doing previously. And data was just being gathered, right? Was just being gathered. And then they basically had where they lived their normal life for a week, and they kept gathering data. So they had 2 days where there was no exercise at all, whether these people were exercising or not. Then they had 1 week where they were basically just analyzing the diet and letting them go back to their normal sort of exercise sort of routine, whatever they were doing before. And then the intervention started. And so right after that, for 4 days, these individuals did slow walking for 8 hours every day, roughly between 8 and 9 hours. They traveled on average about 22 miles per day during that 4-day period, okay? During that time, during that walk, they were allowed approximately 325 calories per day, okay? And these calories, they split the group up. The calories were either by whey in one group or by a pure sucrose mixture in the other group. So this was a liquid whey protein shake or a sucrose, beverage, basically like a Gatorade type thing. Drank in 3 times per day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, a liter each. And it came to the equivalent of about 325 calories per day. They also were able to drink a very dilute electrolyte beverage as much as they wanted during this time. But they took in about 325 calories. So here you have a group of 15 men, by the way, small study, like I said, all overweight, BMI greater than 25, walking 8 to 9 hours per day, 22 miles per day, and only consuming 325 calories per day. Now, you can kind of think, you might say, Jade, what was the calorie deficit? This is a huge deficit. Every single day, their deficit was estimated to be at about 5,000 calories burned per day that they did not replace through food, right? So the amount of total daily energy expenditure versus the amount of calories they took in the difference was about 5,000, right? That's a huge calorie reduction in a very short period of time, okay? This was repeated, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Then the study continued to go, but the diet, that regime, that 325 calories, 8 to 9 hours per day walking stopped, and they went into a control period for 3 days. This control period was where they basically were given an isoenergetic or isocaloric diet, right? And they kept walking, but only 10,000 steps per day. So you can almost see this as sort of a step down, sort of bringing them out of this extreme thing slowly, right? So they do this 4 days extreme. Then they have this 3 days where they kind of come out. They're still walking, but they're only doing 10,000 steps per day, which is, probably about somewhere between, 5 to 10 miles is what they're doing versus 22 miles. And now they basically are in this position where they are back isocaloric. Then they are moving to a 4-week period where they are basically going back to their regular diet, whatever they were doing before for 4 weeks. And then they go and continue doing that for the rest of the year. And the reason I go through these 4 different phases, or these 5 different phases actually, is because I want to show you how the researchers sort of followed up. So phase 1 was basically this idea of, okay, we're going to test you when you're not exercising. Then we're going to test you during your normal life, whether you're exercising and eating. And then phase 2 was, we're going to give you this very extreme 4-day, 325 calories per day, 8 hours of walking, 8 to 9 hours of walking per day, right? And then we're going to move you into 3 days of isocaloric. We're going to give you back food that you need for your body weight. And we're going to keep you walking, but not as extreme. And then we're going to let you go back in phase 4 to your normal sort of habits. Then we're going to measure you. And say phase 5, we're just going to let you go out through the year and do your thing. And so basically, in short, this was 4 days of extreme diet and walking. And then that's it for the entire year. So let's look at the results of what happened. Well, during the study, what ended up happening is they lost 11 pounds in 4 days, 4.9 kilograms. Okay, makes sense? And they also lost 5 pounds of fat in those 4 days. Now, you might be saying, well, Jade, that's 5 and 11, that's 6 pounds of fat. Where did the other 6 pounds go? That was lost in water and lean muscle mass and tissue, right? So most of that was probably water, but they certainly lost some muscle with an extreme regime like this. But 5 pounds of pure fat. Now, a month after this, what ended up happening is they lost another 8 pounds of fat after 1 month, despite returning to self-monitoring the diet and exercise. In other words, they kept losing fat. So they lost fat 5 pounds during that 4-day extreme, and then they lost another 3 pounds of fat after going back to their normal diet and just what they were doing before this. So it's almost like this regime had this sort of afterburn effect. Now, we can't be sure whether or not these individuals, and it really wasn't talked about in the study, just kept on being active. Maybe they just were like, well, I enjoyed that walking, I'm just going to walk more. And that's probably what happened here. Nonetheless, though, they kept up fat loss. So now they're 8 pounds of fat down. Now, here's the part that is amazing. 1 year later, now you would think 1 year later, 4 days versus 361 days. You would think the 361 days would have wiped this whole thing out and they would be regain the weight. Or if it was like the standard thing we see with continuous energy restriction, they may have even gotten fatter. Instead, 1 year later, they still were down 4 pounds in fat compared to what they were before this 4-day intervention. So the results were apparent 1 year later. And there were also multiple beneficial physiological changes that they enjoyed the entire year from this 4-day study. By the way, you might be wondering, if you're a science nerd, was there a difference between the sucrose group and the whey group? Well, just carbohydrate versus protein. You would think the extra protein might make them hold on to muscle better or had better results. Nope, no difference between the two groups. So this is an example of this intermittent energy restriction approach. Severe weight loss during the trial, and then lasting fat loss throughout. They did not regain the weight. They were still down a year later, despite just being told to go back to their normal lifestyle. Now, we can't rule out, and it wasn't talked about in the study, that this study resulted in these men just saying, hey, I enjoyed that. I lost some weight. I'm just going to adapt this as a lifestyle. We can see that sometimes this happens. Change can happen in 2 ways. It can happen all at once in sort of these lightning strike moments, or it can happen sort of slowly over time. We typically think about habit change happening slowly. However, there is something to be said for these men who were sort of out of shape and not exercising and maybe not eating so well, to being given this sort of seeing themselves as active walkers and being given this extreme sort of version of saying, hey, look, you're a walker, and then them going on and walking sort of after that and being, sort of active individuals after that. We can't rule that out. That may be the whole story here. If it is the whole story, though, it's still pretty cool. And it does mean that we as coaches and we training ourselves, that there's something to be said for taking these extreme actions and maybe them following our psychology forward from that. But we also have to see that there probably was some benefit here with the metabolism. Obviously, they didn't get the hunger, energy, and craving reactions enough to override this newfound sense of self of being an active person. So either this was clearly because they just became active people after that, or as a result of this sort of metabolic changes. And I think we could probably guess it's probably a combination of each, and we don't know which one sort of contributed here. So the question then is, okay, Jade, I see this. I don't know that I'm going to go out and do this extreme study, nor do I think you should. Although I have one of the things that comes up when I tell people about the study, they're like, I wonder if anyone's ever done an event like this. I do have an event called The Journey that I do, that I'm going to be doing every single year. And if you're interested in that particular journey and getting involved and having some of these effects from this particular study, you can get in touch with my staff, support at jadeteta.com, and find out where that is, or just go to jadeteta.com and go to the store and the Next Level Human events, and you can get access to that. All right, so how do you do this for yourself then? Well, you can do this several ways. You can do one of these extreme sort of things, and we can call this, by the way, those of you who've listened to my work, you hear me talk about the different metabolic toggles, EL-EL, EL-EM, EM-EM, and EM-EL. That is, eat less, exercise less, EL-EL. EL-EM, eat less, exercise more. EM-EL, eat more, exercise less, and then EM-EM, eat more, exercise more. So you might be wondering, Jade, what is this? Is this an EL-EL, eat less, exercise less, or is this an eat less, exercise more? Now, these terms are somewhat semantics, but I would say given the extreme deficits here, the very large calorie gap that is occurring, I used to call this maybe eat less, exercise less because there wasn't traditional sort of training, but with this huge calorie gap, this is clearly an eat less, exercise more sort of approach. And so what we can do is take any extreme eat less, exercise more approach, whether it's a keto diet with walking, whether it's a extreme low calorie diet with exercise, whether it is fasting. No matter what it is, we can build this into this intermittent energy restriction. Now, the key, though, is that when you do intermittent energy restriction, this study shows it and the Matador study shows it. You have to be very, very careful to go back to an isocaloric diet after the energy restriction. If you go back to a higher caloric value diet, you are bound to regain the weight. You want to go isocaloric. That happened in the Matador study. That happened in this study. Many people miss this because they think they got to go refeed and re-binge. No, this is hypocaloric, low-calorie diet followed by isocaloric living, okay? Hypocaloric extreme followed by isocaloric living. This is not hypocaloric to hypercaloric. Hypocaloric to isocaloric. Low calorie to normal calorie. You can build this into your lifestyle one time per month, perhaps 1 weekend a month. You could do something like this to begin to drop the weight. And every month, drop 2, 3, 4, 5 pounds maybe as a result of doing this one thing. And then live your normal life isocalorically, normal calories. Can't be binging and stuff. After that, you could do it once a quarter, right? So every quarter. This would be almost like seasonally, once in the spring, once in the fall, once in the winter, once in the summer, right? Or you could do it like it is done here, one time per year. Now, many people ask, well, what about doing this like, sort of every week? Like I know some people do this where they do this sort of 5-2 plan where it's like you fast every single week. Is this an example of intermittent energy restriction? Yes, it is. Although I don't know that you'll necessarily get the same results. So yes, you could do this one time a week as well. The trick, though, is that we don't know, I don't know, and I've used all of those, by the way. I have found that the best results for me usually come one time a month for anyone that has something like 30 pounds to lose, right? somebody who is just trying to maintain once a quarter, once a year, and someone who has a lot of weight to lose, maybe once a week, does make some sense, or I would say more twice sort of monthly rather than every week. You have to be careful, though, because if you do this every week, it can go from perhaps a chronic stress versus an acute stress. We don't know that perhaps you'll start kicking in some of that compensation a little bit more. But you can play around with this. So yes, you can do it one time per week. You can do something like this, and it doesn't have to be 2 days and 4 days, right? So if you're going to do it one time per week, maybe you're just going to fast or have a very low calorie diet one time per week. If you're going to do this twice per month, maybe you're going to have, sort of where you take 2 days of a very low calorie and high walking or high activity sort of days. Should that be 4 days out of the month? If you're going to do it once per month, maybe you do an entire 4 days here, right? So maybe what we're looking at is no more than 4 days, and this is speculation on my part, no more than 4 days of this extreme nature in the month. And I like to use that 4-day barometer there simply because I don't want to trigger off metabolic compensations, and we want enough time to go back isocaloric. So there's this idea of going from a catabolic state back to a homeostatic state, back to a catabolic state, back to a homeostatic state, so that the body does not get too stressed out and doesn't try to compensate. It goes, oh, this is weird. I'm kind of stressed out. Oh, but no, now I'm back to normal. Oh, this is weird. I'm a little stressed out. Oh, but now I'm back to normal. And it just doesn't feel the need to overreact potentially. So that's what I would recommend. No more than 4 days of this per week. And I would recommend for health, maybe at least, 4 of these per year. And obviously, if you're already sort of lean and, doing this, maybe one time per year is useful as well. But hopefully that is helpful for you. Intermittent energy restriction is definitely something that you should try. It is highly effective. I'm going to give you one more clinical pearl here. When you end this extreme calorie reduction, be very aware of hyper palatable hedonistic foods. Remember, we want you to be isocaloric after. What a lot of people will do is let's go get that pizza I've been craving, and they get these reward meals. Be very careful because those cheat meals easily turn into cheat weeks and easily turn an isocaloric diet into a hypercaloric diet, and you will completely wipe out the results from this intermittent energy restriction approach. All right, I hope that's helpful for you, and I will see you at the next show.